No heat, no rice. How high achievers trade talk for execution. There's an old Chinese proverb, talk does not cook rice. Simple sentence, but the older you become, the more responsibility you carry, the more psychologically true it feels. Because eventually you notice something strange about highly capable people. The people doing the most important work are often the least interested in talking about it. They speak carefully, reveal less, promise less. Not because they lack ambition, but because they understand something experience teaches quietly. Execution is expensive. A few years ago, there was a period when almost everyone online was talking about Elon Musk. Not just because of success, because of volume. Interviews, tweets, announcements, predictions, deadlines, promises. And whether someone admires him or dislikes him is not even the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened psychologically around him. People became emotionally attached to the narrative of execution itself. Rockets launching, factories scaling, impossible timelines, constant movement. But if you listen carefully to people who work closely in those environments, you will notice something else. Behind every visible moment was an extreme amount of invisible pressure, meetings, corrections, delays, constant adaptation. Because reality always costs more than the story of reality. And this is something high achievers slowly learn. At lower levels, ambition is often expressive. At higher levels, ambition operational. Early ambition is usually loud. People describe their goals constantly. The startup they want to build, the promotion they want, the future they imagine. And honestly, this is understandable. Before responsibility arrives, ambition still feels emotionally stimulating. Talking about goals, that creates a sensation of movement. The brain partially rewards imagined progress, which is why announcing goals can feel satisfying long before meaningful execution begins. But eventually, serious professionals encounter friction because real execution introduces realities most people underestimate. Competing priorities, operational complexity, trade-offs, human unpredictability. And once someone has lived inside those realities long enough, communication changes. They stop speaking emotionally about outcomes that have not survived reality yet. Not because optimism disappeared, because precision replaced the theatrics. This is why many experienced professionals sound calmer than younger, ambitious people. They're not less driven, they're just more calibrated, because reality teaches restraint. Inside most organizations are usually two kinds of professionals. People who signal movement and people who create movement. At first, they can look very similar. Both sound ambitious. Both understand strategic language. Both appear intelligent. But pressure brings about the distinction. One tries to preserve appearance. The other tries to preserve function. And over time, organizations quietly learn who reduces chaos and who narrates around it. This is one reason many respected leaders appear emotionally restrained during difficult periods. Not disengaged, focused, because execution requires concentration, and concentration becomes quieter as the stake increases. There's another interesting example of this dynamic in sports.
Bryant for the win! Bang!
Kobe Bryant rarely spoke about discipline as performance. Important outcomes are rarely built through emotional intensity alone. They are built through sustained contact with boring reality. And reality usually rewards consistency more than excitement. There's a specific moment many professionals eventually experience, usually during a difficult quarter. Revenue slows, a product launch slips, leadership pressure increases, and suddenly the emotional atmosphere changes. Meetings multiply, visibility increases, everyone starts communicating constantly. People begin explaining instead of solving. I once watched this happen in a meeting. A project had gone badly off track. Executives were frustrated, angry, internal teams defensive, and something fascinating happened psychologically. The loudest people in the room became increasingly emotional. Long explanations, strategic jargons, defensive optimism. Meanwhile, when senior director spoke, no theatrics, no emotional performance. He simply asked, what are the operational problems actually blocking resolution right now? The room went quiet because suddenly everyone had to return to reality, not narrative, not drama, reality. Within 2 weeks, the situation stabilized, not because of charisma, because someone reduced emotional noise and redirected attention towards execution. And this is usually how leadership quietly emerges in organizations, not through dominance, through clarity. The people who become indispensable are often the people who can think clearly after emotion enters the room. Responsibility changes people subtly, especially thoughtful high achievers, because eventually you realize words create expectations, and expectations affect systems beyond yourself, teams, clients, revenue, trust. So, mature professionals become more measured with language, not because confidence disappeared, because consequence entered the equation. This creates a quieter form of ambition, less emotional, more realism. And interestingly, this often makes deeply capable people appear less outwardly ambitious than they actually are, because their attention shifts internally towards execution, towards quality, long-term stability, risk management. At some point, serious professionals stop asking, how impressive does this sound? Instead asking, will this survive reality? The question quietly separates professionals who want recognition from professionals who can actually carry responsibility. One of the quietest transformations successful people experience is this. External validation becomes less emotionally useful because outcomes eventually matter more than recognition. And responsibility, it accelerates this shift. When people depend on your judgment, the emotional reward structure changes. You stop chasing excitement. You start protecting stability. You become less interested in appearing exceptional and more interested in preventing avoidable problems. This sounds less glamorous, but psychologically, it represents maturity, because leadership eventually becomes less about self-expression and more about stewardship. There's a reason many respected executives become harder to read emotionally over time. Not because they stopped caring, because they understand the emotional contagion. An anxious leader creates anxious teams. A reactive executive creates reactive culture. So experienced leaders become disciplined about what they transmit into the environment, even while carrying enormous pressure. Sometimes the calmest person in the room is simply the person most aware of consequences. Most people only see visible outcomes. They rarely see containment, the difficult conversations handled privately, the pressure absorbed silently, the constant correction required to keep systems stable. Execution is often invisible emotional labor, especially in leadership. This is why many high achievers become emotionally quiet over time, not detached, disciplined. Because thoughtful professionals eventually understand something most people underestimate. Panic spreads socially, impulsiveness spreads socially. So they become very careful, not performative, careful. And this internal discipline becomes exhausting in many ways than you can count. Because leadership often requires absorbing it. The people carrying the most responsibility are often managing emotional weight nobody else can fully see. One of the strangest truths about meaningful work is that real execution often looks unimpressive externally. Refinement, corrections, trade-offs, risk management. No cinematic momentum, just sustained contact with reality. And this is where many ambitious people become disillusioned, because imagined success feels exciting. Real responsibility often feels repetitive, heavy, quiet, administrative. But experienced professionals, they get it. They are more interested whether outcomes are sustainable. This is one of the clearest signs of maturity. Attention shifts away from emotional stimulation towards operational consistency. At some point, high achievers just stop chasing the feeling of momentum and start respecting the discipline of consistency. Talk does not cook rice. Simple proverb, but hidden inside is a deeper truth about leadership and achievement. At lower levels, ambition often sounds loud because identity still depends on being seen, but responsibility changes that. Because once outcomes affect real people, execution becomes more important than expression. And over time, many high achievers quietly trade visibility for focus. The people closest to real responsibility usually become less interested in appearing impressive, because execution has already taught them how expensive reality actually is.